Did you have many other happenings as exciting as the Rosemary event? David asked. My book is full of them, Bob continued, but the time I woke up in a body that was laid out for a viewing in a funeral home was my most frightening experience. And you'd better believe I didn't stay around for the viewing. I didn't even look back to see what the body looked like. Though the experience may have been frightening to Bob at the time, he was far enough away from it to view it humorously. We were all laughing as Bob interjected, "Well, I'm not going to tell you more. You're going to have to buy the book, David. And I'm completely out of copies. When we get them in, they disappear as quickly as I do when I leave my body. Since you live across the mountain, why don't you order one at your local bookstore? The publisher is Doubleday." "I'll do that on Monday," David replied as he wrote the information in his pad of perpetual notes. "But you can talk about the nature of the work you are doing here at Whistlefield, can't you, Bob?" he asked, putting his notepad back in his shirt pocket. "Of course," Bob replied with enthusiasm. "We have just changed our name from Whistlefield Research Laboratories to the Monroe Institute of Applied Sciences. The best way for you to learn about our research is to come over to the lab and let us hook you up so you can personally experience what we do here." We were all so excited about the possibility of learning firsthand what Bob was doing that Rosemary volunteered to come back again in January. So we set a tentative date for our laboratory experience. Rosemary arrived in mid-January, and David and I were happy to see her. At Whistlefield, we pulled into the parking lot surrounding the prefab building we had passed on our first visit. We had no idea at the time that this was the first laboratory of the Monroe Institute of Applied Science, soon to be recognized worldwide. Bob greeted us at the door and immediately took us on a tour of the facilities. The design and layout of the building gave the impression of walking into a laid-back ski resort. Bob escorted us through the living room, with its iron stairway circling up into the Institute's library loft, past a kitchen and offices, and on down a hall toward the laboratory itself. As we walked down the long hall toward what Bob referred to as his control room, I noticed a change in the atmosphere. I felt tingly all over. The atmosphere was charged with very unusual energies. I couldn't analyze or understand my feelings. The air felt electrified as we moved down the hall. We peeked into 3 experimental chambers Bob pointed out as we walked by. He didn't pause to tell us what these rooms were for, because he seemed eager to get to the control room. In Pied Piper fashion, we kept pace behind him. I was pulling up the rear of our group, and by the time I walked into the control room, Bob was in his chair, twirling knobs. It reminded me of a scene out of Star Trek. I was so awestruck that if Bob had announced that the Monroe Starship Enterprise was ready for takeoff, I would have gone along without batting an eye. In fact, I would have been one of the most eager passengers. I carefully watched Bob's face as he continued flipping switches and pushing buttons as if he were indeed preparing for takeoff. I was so mesmerized that he startled me when he suddenly swung his chair around and asked which of us wanted to go into one of the experimental chambers for a session. We all eagerly volunteered. "Bob, is there a name for those booths?" I asked as we walked back down the hallway toward them. "The experimental chambers are called CHEC units, CHEC, he replied. "What does CHEC stand for?" I asked. "Controlled Holistic Environmental Chamber," he said. David chimed in. "I think Bob is giving us a fancy name for a room with no outside interference." "You got it," Bob said as he motioned each of us into a unit. I heard Bob greet someone in the hallway as we examined the waterbeds we would be lying on. One of his lab assistants had just come by at the right moment. I heard Bob ask him to wire us up for the experiment, and then Bob headed back to his control room. I was sitting nervously on the side of my waterbed when I heard the technician say something to David and then close his door. As he came to my door, which was still open, I was flippantly thinking, perhaps in good Star Trek style, they're going to beam us up into another dimension. Little did I know how accurate my thoughts were on this momentous occasion of getting wired into Check Unit 2 for the first time. I was prepared to lie down when the lab technician asked me to take off my shoes so that he could attach electrodes to the toes of my left foot. He did the same to the third finger of my left hand. Then he placed electrodes behind my ears. I made a mental note to ask Bob what these wires were all about, if and when we got out of these eerie booths. New experiences can elicit fear, and I wasn't exempt from this sometimes unwanted emotional monitor we were born with to keep us out of trouble. The technician put a set of headphones on me and asked me to lie down on the waterbed. He placed a microphone directly in front of my mouth. My nervousness inspired a multitude of anxious thoughts and questions. I wondered what I would do if someone yelled "fire" while I was wired into this soundproof room. I managed to relax somewhat in spite of my apprehension and the equipment that was attached to me. My pulse quickened when the technician walked out, closed the door, and left me alone in that silent room of total darkness. I lay there anxiously awaiting what would happen next when a tone sounded in my right earphone. Bob's voice broke in, announcing, "You are now hearing a tone in your right ear. If you are not hearing a tone in your right ear, please turn your headphones around." Mine was on correctly. As I became more and more relaxed, an ocean surf sound rolled gently into my ears and moved back and forth inside my head. It was a strange feeling that I had never experienced before. As the sensation of movement became more prominent, it began to feel as if a slow-motion tennis game were being played inside my brain. When this energy movement subsided, I went into a deeply relaxed state. The soothing quality of Bob's voice, along with the intoxicating sounds, seemed to do a job on my nervous system. I could feel every cell in my body applauding this opportunity to relax after several days of entertaining our New York guest. The next thing I remember was Bob saying, "And now you are back, wide awake, alert, and full of energy." It took me a few seconds to figure out where I was. I thought, good heavens, I flunked my first experiment. Then Bob announced over the microphone that when we were ready we could leave our check units, but he suggested that we take our time coming back. I took him at his word. Don't know how long I lay there before I got up. I was thinking that my body was more relaxed than it had ever been in my life. I wasn't sure what sounds Bob had put in my ears, but my body certainly reacted favorably to them. By the time I got out of my check unit, the whole crew was having coffee at the opposite end of the building. I followed their laughter. When I walked into the living room, my other two exploring companions, David and Rosemary, were talking excitedly about their experiences. As they talked, Bob nodded knowingly, as if to say, "Yes, that's a typical experience people have." David beat me to the question when he asked Bob what the electrode feedback told him about us. "Try me," David replied. "Well, what is an EEG apparatus?" "Doesn't that register brainwave patterns?" David asked. "Yes, we of course have electrical patterns in our brains," Bob replied, "and I can look at my EEG instrumentation and read what your brain is telling me about your body's activity. But I'll wager you don't know what an EMG machine is." Watch your step, Bob," I cut in. "You are challenging a magna cum laude graduate of Harvard with a major in psychology. I'm sure he's retained some of his hard-earned knowledge." I saw a gleam in Bob's eyes, but he was a person who always acknowledged credentials. David replied quickly, "Actually, I don't know what an EMG is." Bob was something of a "I got you" tone in his voice, told us that the EMG is a muscle tone apparatus that registers pulse rate and body voltage. Then Bob turned and said, "The machines very clearly told me that you went sound asleep." I was stunned and embarrassed. I didn't think anybody would know I'd fallen asleep if I didn't say anything. My face turned beet red, needing to find some excuse other than my tiredness. I said, "But Bob, it was those crazy sounds that you rolled around in my brain that did it. I have never had anyone play slow-motion tennis in my head before. What in the world were those sounds?"